Yeah.
Thanks so much, Francesca. Thanks for the nice introduction. Yeah, I'll just start off, set the scene, a few slides here to try and untangle some of the concepts within sustainability, and my two fellow speakers will continue that and go much deeper into some aspects where their expertise applies. So robotics and sustainability. If you do a search for sustainability on the web, you'll very quickly come across this graphic. So the Sustainable Development Goals were created within the United Nations. It's being promoted by the great people of the ITU. And it's really fantastic that they've been able to break down and consolidate some of the aspects of development. So this really is about development, even if it says sustainable in the goal. It's a great motivating global vision that we can all rally around as citizens and voters. But if you're directly involved with making decisions about making robots, building robots, using robots, it's a little bit vague. It's not very precise about who does what and when and how. So I'm going to try to go a little bit beyond the SDGs, which have their place, so that as engineers and designers and scientists and business people and people in the community, we know what that means for us. Particularly pick out three at the bottom there: life below water, life on land, and peace, justice, and strong institutions, where we've actually seen some uses of robotics which go somewhat against that. So it's important to bear in mind that SDGs on their own is only part of the picture. So let me take a couple of concepts that are well discussed within, say, economics, one of which is the idea of externalities. So if you do something in the world, especially if you run a business or you carry out some action, it is quite possible that it has some side effect that you're not always aware of and you're not always paying the cost for. The example in the graphic there is about using water. Water is often free. So if you take some water, you can irrigate your land or drink it or do something nice with it. But in doing so, you maybe reduce the amount of water. So you place a burden on others, and there are costs that you're not incurring in making sure the water is available, is clean, is safe. Those of you who attended our first webinar in the series will remember that Fiacre talked about the free rider problem. This is a very similar idea. Someone takes a free ride on a resource that's not properly exchanged. And it applies for water, it applies to the air, it applies for many natural resources and other resources. So when we talk about sustainability, I think it's useful to think about externalities. What effect do we have on the world around us? And what will that do in the long term? The other aspect, I think, which is quite useful is to think about it, entrepreneurs seizing opportunities. Some of you may know this idea that if life gives you lemons, you build a lemonade stand. So if there are lemons hanging off a tree, you can pick those lemons and it's hot. You make lemonade and you sell it for 10 cents. Everybody's happy. So this, in a sense, is using surplus resources. The lemons aren't available later. They will fall to the ground and rot. And in the summertime, it's warm, at least in Europe it is. And people are interested in getting hold of some lemonade to cool down. So there's opportunities in resources and opportunities in time. So thinking about the time scale over which sustainability works. Sustainable need not be forever. If the lemons are sustainable, they will come back again next year. Some resources are finite, some are cyclical. We think about solar energy. That's available in the daytime, but less so at night, and so on and so on. So the tides, the seasons, all these phenomena in nature mean that seizing an opportunity doesn't necessarily make it not sustainable, but you have to think about what timescale it refers to. Let me move on. So sustainability in the SDGs is great. But if we think about the types of impact, it's perhaps also useful to think of it in terms of what are we affecting in the world? And here I break it down into three different categories. So we often think about the environment. We see pictures of the environment. It's often in the news. So environmental impact is certainly one that's very high in our awareness. So we're talking about CO2, rare earth metals, waste and pollution and plastics. So that's really dealing with the world of atoms and molecules. And obviously that affects us as human beings in the world, and it affects the people and animals around us and the plants. Another aspect, though, complementary to that, is in the world of bits and data and culture. So we think about society, some people call it human. What is acceptable? What is an acceptable way to treat people? To use them, to work them too hard, to make them live and operate in difficult circumstances as an ethical and moral view, which is separate from that of the environment. And that is one that, again, was brought up in our first webinar, and certainly one to be taken very seriously. For many people, it's an important part of their values. And then I distinguish a third type, which is the strange world of bits, which is dollars and money. So the economic sustainability is also quite important. We want jobs, we want prosperity, but we don't want to do it to the point where it destroys things. So those three aspects, I feel are useful elements of the impact, and I'll use those in the next few slides. So what I'm suggesting here is we look at sustainability, not just through the development lens, but also through these three other aspects: environmental, societal, and economic. I'm not going to give you many answers today, but I will ask some questions. There are many applicable models and frameworks. So it's encouragement to go and look out there to see what there is. People talk about net zero, the circular economy. We'll hear more about that later. Design for sustainability. And you find many companies that have put in place systems of corporate social responsibility. They want to be good corporate citizens. And some companies are creating things like right to repair, and you'll see the sharing economy. We're all familiar with the companies that promote that. This is a big box of possibilities, and we will be looking at those in more detail in future sessions. Today, I just want to lay out some of the dimensions. The other aspect is to think about who and when. So we know that robots can contribute to, for example, monitoring the environment. For example, people are using drones to fly over farmland and wilderness spaces to find out what's happening in ways that are very hard to do otherwise, very expensive to do. And we also know that robots are being used to make, for example, renewable energy products. So solar cells there, but many other examples. These are very important contributions to the environment. But these are uses of the robot. So in this slide, I try and untangle the life cycle of the robot and distinguish that from the use of the robot. So in the middle there, you've got the use of the robot, sustainability by the robot. And of course, there are many ways in which robots could be used sustainably: managing waste, supporting new infrastructure, developing new services. But we also need to look at the people who design the robots. So at the early phases, concept and design, the engineers and designers, the people who manufacture the robots, and how we ensure that robots are properly retired, reused, or recycled. So you see the difference there between by the robot in use and of the robot in its design and construction. And we're a reasonable way down the road for sustainability by the robot, but thinking of robots as devices, artifacts that must be sustainable, I think we're a lot earlier in the process, and one of the reasons I think why we brought together this series. So here we see the kind of people who play in this role: users and operators, researchers, governments and civil society, entrepreneurs, and designers, and also civil society in the retirement process. So consider the stakeholder. That's the designer, the operator. It's me, it's the panel here, and in many cases, I think it will be you in the audience. Okay, let me take a little very short diversion through the different routes I talked about before. So I mentioned net zero. This is a diagram for the National Health Service in the UK, which quite recently has realized that it's actually quite a bad polluter. It generates a big carbon footprint, and there's a lot of interest right now in reducing that. So in their paperwork, in their promotional material to themselves, 100,000 people, 1 million people work there, as well as to the general population, distinguishing scope 1, so that's direct creation of carbon, release of carbon; scope 2, which is the use of electricity, where the carbon is created elsewhere, but generated because of the use of electricity in the organization; and scope 3, which is indirect. So when people come to the hospital, when you use something in the hospital that's been bought from outside, all of that is scope 3, not directly under the control of the hospitals, but it is under the control of the customers and the suppliers and the users and the doctors. So this kind of breakdown has been very useful in, first of all, measuring what's happening, looking at the cost of ownership, looking at the recycling, and who can do what when. So very, very motivating and very useful and pragmatic framework within which to look at environmental pollution. If I look a little bit now at societal, so one aspect is to consider the materials in your supply chain. We've got a war on in some parts of the world, and there are sanctions in place, and some industries are taking care of that, and some industries are taking less care of where the materials are coming from and making choices as to what are used in producing, for example, robots, which have motors, which have magnets, which have rare elements, which have plastics and electronics, and all of those things which come from pretty much all over the world. Who is supplying that and under what conditions? We can likewise consider the appearance of the objects, and equity, diversity, inclusion is a very hot topic for many of us right now. You can buy an iPhone cover, a mobile phone cover, which reflects your values of any rainbow color you like. But if you go look at the robot world, you'll pretty much see all the robots are white. So we see a discrepancy there between how far the mobile phone markets has got and where robots are right now. We could also consider the fair use of the data. The large language models that a lot of people are talking about, ChatGPT, are often trained on data where the copyright is questionable. So is that a fair use? How do we use those? Maybe there's a next generation that would be fairer and better. And also consider the misuse and bias involved with using some of those tools and the misuse that can come out of use of a robot or a new robot type. And thirdly, a look again at the economic aspects. So one element is the supply chain again. And I just have to mention the Fairphone example, a mobile phone that's been created, which is fair trade. They've looked at the supply chain for the gold to make sure that's fair, looked at the tin, which came from mines in Indonesia. It's used in the solder, looked at where the cobalt has come from, and try and establish the fair trade systems, which for a long time we've had already in place for things like chocolate and coffee, to make sure that the people who produce these in the developing world are fairly treated and fairly recompensed for what they produce. We look at business models such as the right to repair. So the Fairphone, the new current Fairphone, or last Fairphone, is upgradable to the new Android system because they have a modular design. If the phone breaks, you can make the change yourself without having to be charged a large sum of money on the high street. And also take-back policies. The people who manufacture these products are best placed to know where to recycle. If you take an old glass bottle to the bottle bank, that's fine, but a mobile phone is way more complicated. So building that into the business model is an interesting new possibility. So try and bring all these elements together. Along the top there, you've got this life cycle concept, make, use, and retire. And you can see that the environmental, social, and economic touches on different ways of thinking. What are the materials? What's the energy? What's the supply chain, the business model, the right to repair, and so on. Just give you one more slide on that, which goes into a bit more detail. I won't discuss all of these, but I hope these will come up in future talks and perhaps later on today. There's a lot of material out there, so I encourage you to go out and look and ask questions. Much of it does not yet apply to robotics. So I think it's our job to try and connect people and help to adapt these systems to what will work for robotics. So just as I close now, just summary of some of what I've talked about. Encouragement to learn about and apply the appropriate models and go beyond the SDGs, because they do not tell you what to do when you're making a design decision. Share success and best practice. We need to hear what's going on and help one another. We need to align incentives between all these different stakeholders and be transparent about what we do when we make mistakes, when we have problems, because that builds trust and it will help us move forward. So very, very quickly there, I've just taken a snapshot view of what's going on. Try and set the scene for this session that we're doing today and lay the groundwork for the next 3 sessions after that.